The Middle Ages did not need a single, killer disease, to become dangerous. In many towns, the environment itself created perfect conditions for illness. Imagine a medieval city street in winter, narrow lanes, tall buildings that block sunlight, and muddy ground mixed with animal waste. People walk close together because the streets are tight, and because daily survival depends on constant movement, buying food, carrying water, working, or selling goods. In this world, disease does not arrive like a sudden disaster. It grows quietly from daily life. Most medieval cities lacked modern sanitation systems. Waste disposal often depended on open pits, simple drains, or dumping refuse into the street. Human waste, animal droppings, rotting food scraps, and stagnant water could remain in public areas for long periods, especially during cold seasons when cleaning became harder. These conditions allowed harmful bacteria to spread through contaminated hands, water, and surfaces. Even without knowing what germs were, people noticed patterns. Sickness was common after floods, during harsh winters, or when food supplies ran low. Fresh water was another major issue. Many people relied on wells, fountains, or nearby rivers. If a water source became contaminated by waste or runoff, entire neighborhoods could suffer from stomach illnesses, diarrhea, and dehydration, conditions that could quickly become fatal, particularly for children and the elderly. In medieval medicine, these illnesses were not understood as infections, but the effects were obvious: weakness, fever, and rapid decline. Winter made everything worse. Homes were cold, crowded, and poorly ventilated. Families often lived with animals nearby because animals provided warmth and were too valuable to lose. Smoke from fires filled rooms because chimneys were inefficient or missing entirely. Constant smoke irritated lungs and weakened respiratory health. Once coughing and fever started spreading through a household, there were few ways to stop it. Nutrition also played a silent but deadly role. Many ordinary people ate a limited diet: bread, porridge, beans, and whatever vegetables were available. Meat was not daily food for most. During famine years or severe winters, people became malnourished, and a weak body struggles to fight infections. A simple wound could turn dangerous. A mild fever could become a death sentence. This is the true beginning of medieval medical history, not with dramatic surgeries or plague masks, but with the everyday reality that the city itself was an engine of sickness. Before any doctor arrived, before any herb was boiled, the environment had already stacked the odds against survival. To understand medieval diseases, you have to understand medieval infrastructure, because in most towns, illness was not just a medical problem. It was a design problem. Many cities were built quickly, crowded behind protective walls, and constantly growing. Streets became tighter as houses expanded outward. Sunlight and airflow were limited, and dampness was common. Moist, dark environments are ideal for microbes, parasites, and rats. Sanitation systems were extremely primitive compared to modern standards. Some towns had public latrines or cesspits, but maintenance varied widely, and overflow was common. Waste could leak into soil and water sources. Refuse, rotting vegetables, bones, manure, often piled up in corners or near markets. Even when rules existed, enforcement was inconsistent. Medieval governments did not have modern municipal cleaning services, and during times of war, famine, or plague, basic order broke down completely. Water was life, but water was also danger. Wells were not always protected from contamination, and rivers were often used for multiple purposes: drinking, washing, butchering animals, and dumping waste. The result was a repeating cycle of gastrointestinal disease. Dysentery, typhoid-like illnesses, and severe diarrhea were devastating, not because people were weak, but because dehydration kills quickly when there is no proper medical rehydration therapy. Crowding was another factor. Medieval cities brought together humans and animals in close proximity. Rats thrived around stored grain. Fleas and lice lived in clothing and bedding. When people lived in shared rooms, slept near each other, and wore the same heavy garments for long periods, parasites had no difficulty moving from one body to another. Lice, in particular, played a role in the spread of typhus in later outbreaks, while fleas became historically associated with plague transmission. At the same time, many medieval people believed bad smells could cause disease. This idea, often called the miasma concept, was incorrect in terms of microbes, but it was not completely irrational. Bad smells were frequently produced by rotting waste and stagnant water, which were genuinely linked with unsanitary conditions. People were noticing real patterns, just interpreting them through the best explanations available at the time. Nutrition and immune strength mattered deeply. During winter, food diversity decreased, and vitamin deficiencies became more common. When the body lacks nutrients, wounds heal slowly, infections spread faster, and respiratory illness becomes harder to survive. Even diseases that might be mild today could become deadly under those conditions. And then there was the constant danger of minor injuries. A small cut from work, a blister turning into infection, a tooth decay leading to fever, these were everyday risks. Without antiseptics, antibiotics, or sterile tools, infection could spread through the bloodstream. Many people did not die from the original disease, but from complications that followed. So when we talk about medieval medicine, we must begin with a hard truth: the medieval world created perfect conditions for sickness. People were not careless. They were trapped in a system where survival came with unavoidable exposure to disease. Before microscopes, before modern anatomy, and long before bacteria were understood, medieval medicine relied on systems of interpretation, frameworks that helped explain why people became sick and how they might be cured. One of the most influential frameworks in medieval Europe was the theory of the four humors. This idea did not begin in the Middle Ages. It came from ancient Greek medical traditions, strongly associated with physicians like Hippocrates and later developed through the writings of Galen. Medieval doctors inherited this model and used it as a foundation for diagnosis and treatment. The four humors were believed to be four fluids inside the human body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, in this view, was the result of balance. Disease was the result of imbalance. If a person had too much blood, they might appear flushed, restless, or feverish. Too much phlegm could be linked to sluggishness, coldness, or heavy mucus. Yellow bile might be associated with heat, anger, or digestive disturbance. Black bile was often connected with melancholy, fear, and deep weakness. Medieval doctors did not see these humors in a modern scientific sense. They were not measuring chemicals or pathogens. But they were observing symptoms, temperature changes, skin color, mood, sleep, appetite, and trying to build logical explanations. The humor system offered a method: identify which humor dominated, then remove or counteract it. This belief shaped almost every treatment. Bloodletting, for example, was not random cruelty. It was a strategy to reduce excess blood and restore balance. Purging and vomiting were used to clear the body of harmful humors. Dietary control was also central. Certain foods were classified as hot, cold, dry, or wet, and a physician might recommend foods to correct a patient's internal state. Someone believed to be too cold might be advised to eat warming foods or avoid damp environments. Seasons mattered too. Winter was associated with cold and wet qualities, which meant phlegm-related illnesses were expected to be more common. Summer, hot and dry, was associated with yellow bile and fevers. Even the time of day could influence diagnosis. Medieval medical thinking tried to connect the human body to nature itself, weather, climate, and the rhythms of the world. Of course, this system could not explain infections accurately. It could not identify plague bacteria, or viruses, or contaminated water. But it did something important: it created structure. It gave doctors a professional identity and created a consistent language of health. It also made medicine predictable to patients, who wanted to believe their illness had a reason and a method of treatment. This is why medieval medicine cannot be dismissed as stupidity. It was an early attempt to build medical logic with limited tools. The problem was not the desire to heal. The problem was the absence of modern biological knowledge. And in a world filled with deadly disease, the four humors became the map people relied on, even when the landscape was far more dangerous than they could imagine. In medieval Europe, medicine was not one profession. It was a fragmented world of different roles, different skills, and very different levels of trust. If someone became ill in a medieval town, the person who helped them depended on wealth, location, and the seriousness of the problem. At the top of the social hierarchy were learned physicians. These were educated men, often trained in universities or in formal scholastic traditions where medical knowledge was closely connected to classical texts. Their work was built around observation, theory, and interpretation. They focused on diagnosis, diet, and balancing the body's humors through controlled treatments. Many physicians rarely performed physical procedures themselves. Their authority came from knowledge, language, and connection to elite society. Below them were barber surgeons. These practitioners handled the physical side of medicine, cutting, stitching, extracting teeth, draining abscesses, treating wounds, and performing bloodletting. They were practical workers, often operating in busy towns where injuries and infections were common. The barber surgeon's tools were not delicate, they were functional. Their work could save lives, but it was also extremely risky in a world without sterile technique. Even a well-done procedure could lead to fatal infection afterward. Then there were apothecaries, specialists in medicines. They prepared herbal mixtures, powders, oils, and ointments, often using recipes passed through generations and influenced by ancient texts and regional traditions. Their shops were centers of smell and texture, dried herbs, crushed roots, resins, and animal-based substances. An apothecary might not diagnose like a physician, but they supplied the material tools of treatment. Outside the formal systems, village healers and midwives carried knowledge that was practical and local. They treated fevers, injuries, childbirth complications, and common infections using experience-based remedies. Their methods were not always written down. Many of them had a deep understanding of plants, body signals, and survival care. In rural regions, these were often the first line of defense against disease. Religious institutions also played a medical role. Monasteries and convents sometimes cared for the sick, not only through prayer but through nursing, shelter, and basic treatment. Many medieval hospitals were connected to religious charity. They provided beds, food, and comfort, often more valuable than complex, medical, procedures. The important truth is this: medieval healthcare was shaped by social structure. The rich had access to learned physicians. The working class relied on barber surgeons and local healers. The poor often had only family care, prayer, and whatever simple remedies could be found. This diversity created conflict and competition. Physicians sometimes looked down on surgeons as mere craftsmen. Surgeons sometimes viewed physicians as theorists who avoided real work. Meanwhile, patients judged by results. In a world where death was common, people trusted whoever seemed to help. Understanding these roles helps us understand medieval treatments. It explains why certain methods became popular, why some practices spread rapidly, and why medical progress was slow. In the Middle Ages, knowledge existed, but it was divided, unequal, and limited by the harsh reality of daily survival. When people imagine medieval medicine, they often picture dramatic procedures. But for most sick individuals, treatment looked very different. It was not an operating room. It was care, basic, repetitive, and limited. Medieval hospitals existed, but they were not hospitals in the modern sense. Many were charity institutions connected to churches, monasteries, or wealthy patrons. Their purpose was often spiritual as much as medical, to provide shelter, food, and comfort to the poor, travelers, the elderly, and the sick. In many cases, simply having a warm place to rest and regular meals could mean survival. Inside a medieval infirmary, conditions were crowded. Beds were often made of straw, placed close together, and shared air carried the sound of coughing, feverish breathing, and quiet suffering. Infection control did not exist as a scientific concept. Caregivers did not understand bacteria, so separating patients was inconsistent. During major outbreaks, such places could become dangerous centers of transmission. Yet, despite their limits, medieval caregivers developed routines. They washed linens when possible, applied herbal compresses, and offered warm broths or diluted drinks. In monasteries, monks and nuns sometimes served as nurses. They observed symptoms and offered simple supportive care, such as keeping patients warm, encouraging rest, and cleaning wounds. These actions may sound basic, but they mattered. Hospitals also reflected the social inequality of the time. The wealthy usually stayed at home, cared for privately, sometimes with physicians visiting them. The poor had fewer options. If a person had no family to help, a hospital was one of the only places where they might receive consistent care. Religious belief shaped medical life here too. Many caregivers saw illness as connected to spiritual trials. Prayer, confession, and rituals were common. But this did not mean care was only religious. It was often both, spiritual support and physical assistance were combined. In a time where medicine could not guarantee a cure, comfort became part of healing. Hospitals also became places where medical knowledge slowly circulated. A physician might consult with religious caregivers. An apothecary might supply herbs. A surgeon might treat a wound. Even without modern science, these institutions created repeated experiences with sickness, and repeated experience is the foundation of learning. Still, the limitations were brutal. Without antibiotics, without effective vaccines, and without reliable methods to stop infectious spread, many people died despite care. The hospital was not a symbol of certainty. It was a place of hope, charity, and human effort against a world that often won. To understand medieval medicine, we must see these spaces clearly: crowded rooms, low light, cold air, exhausted caregivers, and patients waiting, not for miracles, but for relief. This is where medieval healthcare truly lived, in long nights, shared suffering, and the fragile endurance of ordinary people. In medieval life, winter was not simply cold weather. It was a survival test that weakened the human body long before disease appeared. The season shaped mortality in silent ways, through hunger, vitamin deficiency, damp housing, and constant smoke. Food supply in the Middle Ages depended on harvest cycles. When crops failed, or storage was poor, winter became a time of scarcity. Even in normal years, ordinary people relied heavily on grain-based foods, bread, porridge, and simple stews. Fresh vegetables became limited. Fruit was rare. Meat was often saved for special occasions, and dairy could be inconsistent. This lack of variety weakened bodies over time. A person who is malnourished has fewer resources to fight infection, to heal wounds, and to survive high fevers. Cold housing made the problem worse. Many homes had limited insulation, thin walls, and leaky roofs. Families slept close together to preserve warmth. The crowded sleeping arrangement helped conserve heat, but it also created perfect conditions for the spread of respiratory illness. One person coughing could infect everyone in the room. When sickness entered a household, there was rarely space to isolate the sick. Fire was essential, but it had a cost. Indoor smoke irritated eyes and damaged lungs. In many buildings, ventilation was weak, meaning people inhaled smoke daily. Modern research shows that long exposure to smoke can increase respiratory vulnerability, and medieval people lived in that environment for years. Their lungs were under constant stress. This made infections like pneumonia far more dangerous. Winter also increased the risk of injuries and infection. Cold reduces circulation in extremities, making wounds heal more slowly. Wet clothing and prolonged dampness weaken skin barriers. A small cut might become infected, especially when washing was difficult and water sources were cold or contaminated. Even basic cleanliness became harder when everything froze and resources were scarce. This is why medieval disease history cannot be separated from medieval living conditions. A microbe alone does not define the outcome. The body's condition matters. A healthy person might survive a fever. A malnourished person might collapse quickly. And in winter, malnutrition was widespread. For children, the danger was even greater. Childhood immunity is still developing, and medieval childhood included constant exposure to parasites, poor hygiene, and limited nutrition. Many children did not survive beyond early years, not because people lacked love or care, but because the environment was relentless. Understanding winter explains why some disease outbreaks became catastrophic. When an epidemic hit a weakened population, mortality could skyrocket. People were already exhausted, hungry, cold, and physically stressed. Medicine in this context was almost powerless. So if you want to understand medieval healing, you must begin with the harsh foundation, a weak body in a hostile season. Winter was not only a weather pattern. It was a medical factor. It shaped who survived, who recovered, and who never had the strength to fight at all. In medieval Europe, fever was one of the most frequent and feared symptoms. People did not identify viruses or bacteria, but they recognized a pattern: fever often came before collapse. In medical terms, fever is a systemic response where the body raises its temperature to fight infection. Medieval physicians could not explain this mechanism, yet they understood fever as a sign that the body was in danger. Fevers in the Middle Ages had many causes. Respiratory infections were common in winter due to overcrowded homes, smoke exposure, and poor ventilation. Gastrointestinal infections caused by contaminated water or spoiled food were also widespread and could produce fever, weakness, and dehydration. Wound infections were another major source of fever. Even a small cut could become infected, leading to widespread inflammation and sometimes death. Medieval doctors attempted to classify fevers by their timing and behavior. They observed whether the heat was constant or came in waves. They looked for sweating, chills, rapid pulse, and confusion. Without laboratory testing, the clinical signs were the only available data. This observation-based approach was limited but not meaningless. Many medieval medical texts describe careful attention to the patient's appearance, thirst, sleep, breathing, and mental state. The danger of fever in that time was not only the infection itself, but the lack of supportive treatment. Today, fever is rarely fatal by itself because modern medicine can manage hydration, inflammation, and infection. In medieval settings, dehydration from sweating and diarrhea could quickly weaken the body. A patient who could not drink enough water would deteriorate rapidly. Children and elderly people were especially vulnerable because they lose fluids faster and have less physical reserve. Treatments for fever focused on cooling and balancing. Doctors often recommended rest, light food, and avoiding heavy meats or alcohol. They sometimes used herbal infusions to reduce discomfort. Common ingredients included willow bark for pain relief, which contains salicylates, mint for nausea, and honey for soothing the throat. These remedies could ease symptoms, but they did not remove the infectious cause. Bloodletting was also used for fever, based on the belief that excess blood created heat. In reality, bloodletting could make a weak patient worse by reducing oxygen transport and overall strength. Yet, in the medieval framework, it was considered rational. If fever was seen as an overflow of heat and blood, removing blood appeared logical. Another key medieval concept was bad air or miasma. People believed that foul smells could create disease. This was incorrect scientifically, but it sometimes led to useful behavior. Burning herbs, opening windows, and avoiding crowded areas could reduce exposure to infected people, even if the reason was misunderstood. Fever, therefore, was not a single disease. It was a warning signal that appeared across many infections. In the Middle Ages, fever often marked the start of a medical crisis, because once it appeared, there were few reliable tools to stop what came next. No medieval disease is more famous than the Black Death, the pandemic that devastated Europe in the mid-14th century. Modern science identifies the main cause as the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It is most commonly associated with flea transmission, often involving rats and human living conditions. In medieval life, the disease spread rapidly because the environment supported rodents, parasites, and close human contact. The most recognized form was bubonic plague. Its name comes from buboes, swollen, painful lymph nodes that appeared in the groin, armpit, or neck. Along with buboes, patients often developed sudden high fever, chills, headache, extreme weakness, and confusion. In many cases, the disease progressed quickly, sometimes killing within days. There were also pneumonic and septicemic forms. Pneumonic plague affected the lungs and could spread through respiratory droplets, making it capable of direct human-to-human transmission. This form caused cough, difficulty breathing, and rapid collapse. Septicemic plague involved infection in the bloodstream, leading to systemic failure and sometimes dark skin discoloration from tissue damage and bleeding under the skin. Medieval observers described dark patches, which likely contributed to the Black Death label, though the term also reflects the scale of mortality. Medieval people did not know bacteria or vectors. Their explanations varied: punishment from God, corrupted air, planetary alignment, or poisonous vapors. Many towns attempted isolation measures. Quarantine practices developed more strongly in later outbreaks, where ships and travelers were held away from cities for a set period. While medieval methods were inconsistent, isolation could reduce transmission if applied correctly. Treatments were largely ineffective against plague. Doctors recommended bloodletting, purging, herbal mixtures, and aromatic substances to counter bad air. Some people carried flowers, burned herbs, or used strong-smelling substances to protect themselves. These actions could provide psychological comfort, but they did not reliably stop bacterial infection. The plague's impact was amplified by medieval conditions: malnutrition, cold housing, weak sanitation, and lack of effective care. The death rate was catastrophic. Entire households could vanish. Skilled workers, farmers, and clergy died in large numbers. This caused long-term social consequences: labor shortages, economic disruption, and cultural trauma. From a scientific perspective, the Black Death teaches a critical lesson: a disease becomes a catastrophe when biology meets vulnerability. The bacterium existed, but it was the medieval environment, crowding, fleas, rodents, and limited medical tools, that transformed it into a continent-wide disaster. In the history of medicine, plague is a turning point not because medieval doctors solved it, but because the scale of death forced societies to observe transmission, attempt public health rules, and recognize that illness could spread across populations. Even without modern science, the plague pushed Europe toward the earliest forms of epidemic control. Bloodletting was one of the most widespread medical procedures in medieval Europe. It was used for fever, headaches, swelling, inflammation, and even emotional distress. From a modern medical perspective, routine bloodletting is not an effective treatment for infections and can weaken the patient. But in medieval medicine, bloodletting was based on a consistent theory and was considered controlled practice, not random violence. The procedure was rooted in the humoral model. Blood was seen as one of the four essential humors, and an excess of blood was believed to create heat, agitation, and disease. Removing blood was intended to restore balance. Medieval physicians and barber surgeons often believed that lowering the pressure of blood would reduce fever and prevent severe outcomes. Bloodletting could be performed using a small blade, a lancet, or in some settings, leeches. The practitioner usually selected a vein depending on the symptoms and the medical logic of the time. Some medical texts even included instructions about timing, such as choosing certain days believed to be safer based on astrology or seasonal thinking. In practice, bloodletting sometimes offered short-term relief because lowering blood volume can temporarily reduce a sensation of pressure, and the ritual itself could convince a patient that healing had begun. However, the physiological cost was significant. Removing blood reduces oxygen delivery, lowers energy, and can make it harder for the immune system to fight infection. In a malnourished medieval patient, blood loss could push the body toward collapse. Another major danger was infection. Surgical tools were not sterile. Even if the cut was small, contaminated blades and dirty hands could introduce bacteria. In some cases, this could lead to localized infection or systemic spread. The medieval practitioner might interpret worsening symptoms as bad humors escaping, rather than infection, reinforcing the belief that the method was necessary. Despite these risks, bloodletting persisted for centuries because it fit the dominant medical system and because alternatives were limited. Without antibiotics, without accurate diagnosis, and without knowledge of pathogens, treatments were judged mainly by tradition and immediate observation. A patient who survived might credit bloodletting. A patient who died was often seen as too far gone. From a scientific viewpoint, bloodletting is an example of how medical logic can be internally consistent but biologically wrong. It shows the difference between a theory that feels convincing and a treatment that truly works. Yet it also reflects a deeper truth: medieval medicine was attempting to intervene. People wanted control over illness. Bloodletting gave them a procedure, visible, measurable, and repeatable, at a time when disease felt unpredictable and unstoppable. Herbal medicine was the most widespread and accessible form of treatment in the Middle Ages. Unlike surgery or specialized procedures, herbs could be collected, traded, stored, and prepared in almost every household. Many medieval remedies did not cure infections, but some were genuinely useful for symptom relief. In a time without antibiotics, reducing pain, controlling inflammation, easing cough, and supporting hydration could improve survival chances, especially for mild illness. Medieval herbal knowledge came from multiple sources. Some remedies were learned through local tradition and experience. Others were copied from ancient medical texts, especially those influenced by Greek and Roman medicine and later preserved and expanded through Arabic medical scholarship. Apothecaries became central figures in towns because they prepared standardized mixtures, powders, pastes, syrups, oils, and ointments. Several plant-based remedies had real pharmacological effects. Willow bark, for example, contains salicylates, which are chemically related to modern aspirin. It could reduce pain and fever, although dosage was inconsistent and side effects were possible. Mint and fennel were used to reduce nausea and improve digestion. Honey was used widely for sore throats and wound care, and modern science confirms that honey has antimicrobial properties and supports healing in some wound conditions. Garlic was valued for general protection and was used as a tonic. It contains compounds with antimicrobial activity, though it was not a true cure for severe infection. Herbs were also used as inhalations. In crowded, smoky homes, respiratory illness was common. Some medieval healers used steam and aromatic plants like thyme or rosemary to reduce discomfort and clear airways. While these methods could not treat pneumonia or tuberculosis, they could ease coughing, improve breathing comfort, and help patients sleep. However, medieval herbal medicine had major limitations. The same symptoms could be caused by very different diseases, and without accurate diagnosis, remedies were applied broadly. A fever from plague and a fever from a mild respiratory infection might receive similar treatment. Also, preparation methods varied. Herbal strength depends on dose, freshness, and extraction technique. Some treatments were too weak to matter. Others were strong enough to cause harm, especially if toxic plants were used or mixtures were over-concentrated. Despite this, herbs were often safer than aggressive procedures like repeated bloodletting. For many patients, basic supportive care, warmth, rest, hydration, and gentle symptom relief, was the most realistic path to recovery. Herbal medicine provided tools for that. From a scientific viewpoint, medieval herbalism is important because it represents observation-based experimentation over generations. People noticed what reduced pain, what calmed the stomach, and what helped wounds close. Even without modern chemistry, some effective therapies survived through practice. Herbal medicine was not magic. It was an early form of pharmacology, limited, inconsistent, but sometimes surprisingly useful. In medieval towns, the apothecary was the closest equivalent to a pharmacy. Apothecaries did not only sell herbs. They produced prepared medicines using organized storage, measured ingredients, and repeatable recipes. Their role grew as cities expanded and trade routes made exotic substances available. While medieval pharmacology was far from modern standards, apothecary work represented an important step toward systematic medicine. An apothecary's shop was designed for preservation and preparation. Herbs were dried and bundled to prevent rot. Powders were kept in sealed containers. Oils and resins were stored in clay jars or glass bottles. Many shops used scales and weights to control dosage. This matters scientifically because consistent measurement is the foundation of medical reliability. Medieval apothecaries did not always achieve precision, but they were aiming for repeatability. Their products came in several forms. Powders were mixed into food or drink. Syrups were used for cough and throat irritation. Ointments were applied to skin and wounds. Tincture-like preparations existed, using alcohol or vinegar as solvents. These methods improved extraction of plant compounds and extended shelf life. Apothecaries also handled ingredients beyond plants. Honey, animal fat, wax, vinegar, and wine were common bases. Some mixtures included minerals or metals. This is where medieval medicine could become dangerous. Certain substances, like mercury compounds, were used historically for conditions such as skin diseases. From a modern perspective, these treatments could poison patients. But medieval practitioners were operating without toxicology, and their methods were shaped by tradition and trial. Apothecaries interacted with physicians and surgeons. A physician might diagnose and prescribe a specific mixture. An apothecary prepared it. A surgeon might request ointments or bandages for wound care. In many towns, apothecaries were regulated to prevent fraud, though enforcement varied. The problem of fake or low-quality medicine existed, especially during epidemics when fear increased demand. In a scientific sense, the apothecary system shows the beginning of a medical supply chain, sourcing ingredients, preserving them, measuring them, and distributing them. This structure helped medieval medicine become more organized, even if the underlying biological understanding remained limited. It is also important to emphasize that medieval medicine was not only superstition. The apothecary world included real observation. A certain salve might reduce pain. A syrup might calm a cough. Honey might help wounds close. Even if the mechanisms were unknown, the effects could be recognized. These partial successes helped keep the system alive. However, apothecaries could not control the most important variable, the disease itself. Against plague, typhus, or severe dysentery, herbal mixtures could not stop the infection. At best, they reduced suffering. At worst, they delayed better choices like isolation, rest, and hydration. Still, in an era with few options, apothecaries were essential medical centers, and their work laid the groundwork for later pharmacology. Not every medieval killer was dramatic like plague. Some of the deadliest threats were ordinary and constant. Dysentery and severe diarrheal disease were among the most dangerous, especially in crowded towns and during war, travel, or famine. From a modern medical perspective, dysentery is often caused by bacterial infections such as Shigella, or by amoebic parasites, but medieval people did not know microorganisms. They only saw the outcome: intense stomach pain, weakness, dehydration, and death. The main driver of these illnesses was contaminated water. Medieval cities used rivers for multiple purposes: washing, waste disposal, butchering animals, and sometimes drinking. Wells could also become contaminated, especially if cesspits overflowed or sewage leaked into groundwater. Once water was unsafe, a whole neighborhood could become sick quickly. The scientific reason dysentery becomes lethal is fluid loss. Diarrhea rapidly removes water and electrolytes from the body. Without proper replacement, blood pressure drops, organs fail, and the body cannot regulate temperature. Children are especially vulnerable because they have smaller fluid reserves. In medieval times, even adults could collapse within days if diarrhea was severe. Medieval treatments focused on controlling the symptom rather than the cause. People used herbal teas to calm the stomach, mild broths for nutrition, and sometimes binding foods such as bread or grains. These could help if the disease was mild. But when the infection was strong, symptom control was not enough. Worse, some treatments included purging methods, which increased fluid loss and made the patient weaker. This is one reason medieval medical logic sometimes produced harmful outcomes. One of the few effective strategies was accidental boiling. Hot water kills many pathogens, and soups or boiled liquids were safer than raw water. Medieval people did not always boil drinking water intentionally for safety, but they often consumed warm broths and heated drinks, which reduced risk. Fermented drinks like weak ale sometimes carried fewer pathogens than polluted water, though alcohol content was not necessarily high enough to sterilize everything. Still, beverage choices could affect survival patterns. Dysentery also spread quickly in camps and enclosed environments. During military campaigns, sanitation collapsed. Waste accumulated near water sources. Food handling became unsafe. These conditions created outbreaks that killed more soldiers than battles. In the medieval city, dysentery lacked a dramatic identity. There was no iconic mask, no famous ritual cure, no clear external mark like buboes. People simply became weak, dehydrated, and disappeared. This is why it deserves attention. It represents the lethal power of infrastructure failure and contaminated resources. From a scientific perspective, dysentery demonstrates a basic rule of survival: safe water is a medical technology. In a world without antibiotics, clean water and hydration were some of the strongest protective factors. Medieval people fought visible diseases, but waterborne illness often killed quietly, repeatedly, and relentlessly, making it one of the true engines of medieval mortality. Typhus was one of the most dangerous epidemic diseases associated with crowded living conditions in medieval and early modern Europe. Modern medicine identifies epidemic typhus as caused by the bacterium Rickettsia prowazekii, transmitted primarily through body lice. Medieval people did not understand bacteria or vectors, but they lived in the exact conditions that allowed lice to thrive: heavy clothing worn for long periods, limited washing, shared bedding, and dense urban housing. The key scientific fact is that lice do not spread disease by biting alone. In epidemic typhus, infected lice excrete bacteria in their feces. When a person scratches the irritated skin, the bacteria can enter through small breaks in the skin or mucous membranes. This transmission mechanism is invisible, which is why typhus was so hard to prevent without modern hygiene standards. Symptoms typically began with sudden high fever, severe headache, weakness, muscle pain, and confusion. A rash could develop later. In severe cases, the disease affected the brain and blood vessels, causing delirium, low blood pressure, and organ failure. In medieval settings, where supportive care was limited, many patients died from dehydration, shock, or complications such as pneumonia. Typhus became especially lethal during famine, war, sieges, and mass displacement, situations that increased crowding and reduced hygiene. When large groups of people were forced into camps, city shelters, or shared buildings, lice spread rapidly. The combination of malnutrition and stress weakened immunity, making mortality much higher. Medieval physicians often described these cases as fevers with dangerous mental symptoms. The confusion and agitation could appear supernatural to observers. Without understanding the infectious cause, families and caregivers might interpret delirium as a sign of spiritual attack or severe, humoral imbalance. Treatments therefore focused on fever reduction, rest, bloodletting in some cases, and herbal infusions. None of these could stop the bacterial process. The most effective prevention method, from a modern scientific standpoint, would have been delousing and laundering. Heat kills lice and their eggs. Changing clothing, boiling linens, and reducing crowd density can break transmission. Medieval populations sometimes noticed that cleanliness helped, but consistent implementation was difficult in winter and poverty conditions. Typhus is medically important because it highlights a major principle of epidemic history: not all deadly disease requires contaminated water or rats. Some epidemics are driven by human proximity, clothing, and parasites. In crowded medieval life, lice were a constant presence. Under normal conditions they were a miserable nuisance. Under crisis conditions they became a mechanism of mass death. This is why typhus must be treated as a core medieval killer. It represents the biological consequence of poverty, war, and overcrowding, and it demonstrates that many medieval epidemics were not mysterious. They were predictable outcomes of a world where hygiene systems and medical technology were limited. Tuberculosis was not the kind of disease that arrived suddenly like plague. It was slower, quieter, and often more cruel. Modern science identifies tuberculosis as caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, a bacterium that spreads through the air when infected people cough, speak, or breathe in close proximity. In medieval environments, crowded homes, smoky interiors, and poor ventilation, TB had ideal conditions to spread and persist. Unlike fast outbreaks, tuberculosis often progressed over weeks or months. Symptoms included persistent cough, chest pain, fatigue, night sweats, fever, and weight loss. In late-stage disease, some patients coughed blood due to lung tissue damage. Medieval people recognized these cases as a wasting illness. The victim became thinner, weaker, and paler, and recovery was rare without rest and long-term supportive care. The biology of tuberculosis explains why it was so persistent. TB bacteria can survive in the body for long periods. A person may carry the infection without immediate severe symptoms, then become ill later when weakened by famine, stress, or another infection. This is one reason tuberculosis was strongly connected with poverty and malnutrition. Medieval diets were often insufficient in winter, and repeated shortages created conditions where latent infections could activate. Medieval treatment could not cure TB. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of chronic bacterial infection, and no effective isolation methods. Care focused on symptom management, warm rooms, broth, herbal mixtures for cough, and rest. In some households, sick individuals were kept near the hearth, not only for comfort, but because warmth helped breathing. However, keeping the patient in a crowded room also increased spread to family members. Because tuberculosis was slow, it was often interpreted through social and religious frameworks. Some believed it was a sign of spiritual decline or inevitable fate. But from a medical point of view, TB was a long-term respiratory infection with high transmission potential in poorly ventilated settings. A key factor in medieval TB mortality was smoke exposure. Constant indoor smoke irritates airways and damages lung function over time. This makes respiratory infections more severe and reduces the ability to clear bacteria. Combined with cold air and poor nutrition, the lungs became vulnerable. Tuberculosis also demonstrates the limits of medieval observation. People could see the outcome clearly, chronic cough and wasting, but the true cause was invisible. They could not identify the bacterium or stop airborne spread. Even if they suspected that close contact made illness more likely, they had limited ability to change housing structure or daily routines. In medical history, tuberculosis represents one of the greatest long-term burdens of pre-modern life. It did not cause one famous year of death like plague, it caused continuous death across generations. It is also a reminder that medieval medicine was often powerless not because practitioners lacked effort, but because the tools required to defeat chronic airborne infection did not exist yet. In medieval Europe, winter respiratory disease killed silently and consistently. Many deaths that were recorded simply as fever or chest sickness were likely caused by pneumonia, an acute infection of the lungs. Pneumonia can be caused by bacteria, viruses, or secondary infection after influenza-like illness. In medieval times, even a simple cold could progress into lethal lung infection because the body was weakened and medical support was limited. The scientific danger of pneumonia is reduced oxygen exchange. When lung tissue fills with fluid and inflammation increases, the body struggles to get oxygen into the bloodstream. The patient develops rapid breathing, chest pain, fever, and severe fatigue. Without treatment, oxygen deprivation and systemic inflammation can lead to organ failure. Today, antibiotics and oxygen therapy save many lives. Medieval patients had neither. Medieval living conditions increased pneumonia risk. Homes were cold and damp, and people spent long hours indoors. Crowding increased person-to-person transmission of respiratory pathogens. Smoke exposure from indoor fires irritated the lungs and reduced natural defense mechanisms. Malnutrition weakened immune response, making infections more severe. Medieval caregivers sometimes used methods that provided mild benefit. Warmth mattered. Keeping a patient near the fire could reduce chilling and support breathing comfort. Hydration with warm broths could slow dehydration. Certain herbs may have helped symptoms. Thyme and rosemary were used for cough relief, honey soothed throats, and steam inhalation eased nasal congestion. These methods could support recovery in mild cases, but severe pneumonia often became fatal. Bloodletting was sometimes used, especially when fever was high and breathing was difficult. From a modern medical perspective, removing blood reduces oxygen carrying capacity and can worsen outcomes. In a pneumonia patient already struggling for oxygen, blood loss could accelerate collapse. This shows how medieval medical logic could unintentionally harm patients, even when applied with skill. Another common medieval issue was secondary infection. A person weakened by influenza-like illness could develop bacterial pneumonia afterward. Medieval observers might describe a patient who seemed to recover, and then suddenly became worse. That pattern matches what modern clinicians recognize in secondary bacterial pneumonia. Children and the elderly were at greatest risk. A child with pneumonia can deteriorate quickly due to small lungs and limited reserves. Elderly individuals often had weakened immunity and chronic conditions. In winter, these populations were hit hardest. Pneumonia teaches an important medical lesson about medieval mortality: not all fatal illness was exotic. Many people died from common respiratory infections that became severe due to environment and lack of effective care. These were not rare tragedies. They were seasonal, predictable, and repeated each year. So when we talk about medieval disease, we must include this constant respiratory threat. Winter did not only bring hunger. It brought lung infections. And for many medieval families, pneumonia was the illness that turned an ordinary cough into a deathbed within days. Smallpox was one of the most feared infectious diseases in pre-modern history, including the medieval period. Modern science identifies smallpox as caused by the variola virus. It spreads primarily through respiratory droplets during close contact, and it can also spread through contaminated materials such as bedding or clothing. In medieval cities, crowded, poorly ventilated, and full of shared living spaces, smallpox had ideal conditions to transmit. Smallpox typically began with a high fever, severe fatigue, headache, and body pain. After the initial fever phase, a characteristic rash appeared, often starting on the face and spreading across the body. The rash progressed through stages: flat spots, raised bumps, fluid-filled blisters, and then scabs. This clinical pattern is important because it created a visible identity for the disease. Medieval people may not have understood viruses, but they recognized this illness by sight. The danger of smallpox was not only death. Survivors often carried permanent scars, especially on the face. Some suffered blindness due to eye involvement. Others experienced long-term weakness and secondary infections. In medieval society, visible scarring could affect social status, marriage prospects, and personal identity. Smallpox therefore left both medical and social damage. Mortality varied depending on age and viral strain, but the disease could be devastating, especially for children. A key reason is that childhood immune systems are still developing. In a medieval environment already burdened by malnutrition, parasites, and cold living conditions, immunity was often weaker than in modern populations with stable nutrition and healthcare. This increased mortality. Medieval treatment options were limited to supportive care. Caregivers could provide warmth, fluids, and rest. Herbal mixtures were used to calm fever or reduce discomfort. But there was no cure. The infection had to run its course, and the patient either survived or did not. In severe cases, complications like dehydration, bacterial skin infections, and respiratory failure caused death. From a scientific viewpoint, one of the most important facts about smallpox is immunity after survival. People who recovered became protected against reinfection. Medieval communities noticed that survivors rarely got the same disease again. This observation contributed indirectly to later innovations. Centuries after the medieval period, early forms of prevention such as variolation developed in some regions, deliberate exposure to smallpox material to produce a milder infection and immunity. That practice was dangerous and came later historically, but the medieval period built the long-term human experience that made such prevention imaginable. Smallpox shows how medieval medicine struggled most against highly contagious viral disease. Even perfect wound care or herbal remedies could not stop a respiratory virus spreading through crowded environments. The main factors that shaped outcomes were exposure level, isolation ability, nutrition, and individual immune strength. In medieval disease history, smallpox is critical because it combined high contagiousness with visible long-term effects. It did not only kill. It permanently marked survivors, making it one of the most socially recognizable diseases of the pre-modern world. In medieval life, a dangerous illness did not always begin with coughing or fever. It could begin with a simple cut. A knife slip at work, a splinter, a blister from walking, or a small wound during farming could become fatal. The reason is simple in modern medical terms: infection. When bacteria enter a wound, the body's immune system responds with inflammation. If the infection remains local, it may produce redness, swelling, pus, and pain. But if bacteria spread into the bloodstream, the situation becomes systemic. This is what modern medicine calls sepsis. Sepsis is not just infection. It is a life-threatening body-wide response that can lead to organ failure, shock, and death. Medieval people did not use the word sepsis, but they clearly observed the progression. A wound that looked minor could suddenly worsen. The skin could become hot and swollen. Fever could rise. The patient could become confused, weak, and unable to stand. Some wounds developed blackened tissue, a sign of severe tissue damage or gangrene. In an era without antibiotics, these stages were extremely difficult to reverse. Several medieval conditions made wound infection more likely. Hygiene was limited, especially during winter. Water could be contaminated, and cleaning wounds properly was difficult. Tools were not sterile. A surgeon's instruments might be reused repeatedly. Hands were not disinfected. Linen bandages could carry bacteria if reused or stored poorly. Work itself was risky. Medieval labor was physical, constant, and often performed in dirty environments: farms, stables, workshops. Dirt and manure contain bacteria that can infect wounds quickly. Even if the patient survived the initial injury, infection could appear days later. Medieval treatment methods attempted to stop infection through visible action. Wounds might be washed with wine or vinegar. These liquids have mild antiseptic properties, and in some cases they could reduce bacterial load. Honey was also applied to wounds. Modern research confirms that honey can inhibit bacterial growth and support healing in certain conditions. Herbal pastes were used for swelling and pain relief. Bandages were applied to protect the wound. However, once deep infection developed, medieval medicine had limited answers. One method was cauterization, burning tissue with heat to stop bleeding and attempt to destroy corruption. Another method was draining infected material, which could help in abscesses. But these procedures were risky and could worsen injury or introduce further contamination. The scientific reality is that medieval patients often died from secondary infection. A broken bone might not kill you, but infection afterward could. A small wound might not be fatal, but sepsis could be. This is why medieval mortality was high even without pandemics. The environment continuously produced opportunities for bacteria to enter the body. Wound infection also explains why surgical reputation mattered. Some surgeons developed better practical habits, cleaner bandages, careful wound closure, and experience with draining infections. While they lacked germ theory, practice could still improve outcomes. In medieval medical history, infection was the hidden enemy. It turned ordinary injuries into emergencies. And it made the line between life and death dangerously thin. Medieval surgery existed, but it operated under extreme limitations. Surgeons did not have anesthesia in the modern sense, no antibiotics, and no sterile technique. They had basic tools, practical experience, and speed. In many cases, speed was not just a skill. It was survival, because the patient could not tolerate long procedures due to shock and pain. The most common surgical activities were not complex internal operations. They were external and practical, cleaning wounds, stitching cuts, removing arrows or foreign objects, draining abscesses, setting broken bones, treating burns, and extracting teeth. Surgery was often performed by barber surgeons, whose profession combined grooming work with medical procedures. Their tools were rugged and functional: knives, forceps, needles, and heated irons. Stitching was used to close wounds and reduce bleeding. In modern medicine, wound closure helps healing when paired with sterile conditions. In medieval settings, stitching could trap bacteria inside the wound if it was not properly cleaned. That increased risk of deep infection. Still, leaving large wounds open could also cause bleeding and contamination. Surgeons had to make decisions without knowing microbial biology. Cauterization was another method. By heating an iron and applying it to tissue, surgeons could stop bleeding and destroy superficial contaminated tissue. Scientifically, heat can reduce bacterial load. But cautery also damages healthy tissue and causes major pain. Overuse could worsen injury and delay healing. Yet in certain situations, severe bleeding or infected wounds, cautery may have been one of the few methods capable of preventing immediate death. Abscess drainage was an important practice. When pus forms under the skin, pressure builds and bacteria multiply. Opening and draining an abscess can relieve pain and reduce infection spread. Medieval surgeons understood this through observation. They might not have known bacteria, but they knew that trapped corruption needed to be released. This procedure, when done carefully, could actually save lives. The greatest risk in medieval surgery was postoperative infection. Instruments were reused. Bandages were not sterile. Healing environments were smoky, crowded, and full of parasites. Even a successful procedure could be followed by fever, swelling, and death days later. Pain management was limited. Alcohol, herbal sedatives, and physical restraint were used. Some mixtures contained poppy-based ingredients or other calming herbs, but dosing was unreliable. The reality is that many medieval patients experienced surgery fully conscious. This shaped everything. Surgical procedures favored speed, and only the most necessary interventions were attempted. Medieval surgery teaches a hard scientific lesson: surgical skill is not enough. A safe surgical system requires sterilization, controlled environments, infection prevention, and supportive care. Without these, surgery becomes a high-risk gamble. Still, medieval surgeons contributed to medical history. Their repeated practical experience with injuries created an early foundation for anatomy and procedural knowledge. They were operating in the most difficult conditions imaginable. And even with limited success, surgery remained one of the few direct methods medieval society had to fight injury and infection. Dental disease was a serious medical problem in medieval life, not a minor inconvenience. Tooth decay, gum infection, and abscesses could cause intense pain, swelling, fever, and even death. Modern dentistry understands that severe dental infections can spread into surrounding tissue, the jaw, and even the bloodstream, potentially leading to sepsis. Medieval people lacked this microbiological explanation, but they recognized the dangerous progression: a tooth problem could become a systemic illness. Several factors increased dental problems in medieval populations. Diet was heavily grain-based. Coarse bread and gritty flour wore down enamel. Sugar consumption was lower than modern standards, but decay still occurred due to poor oral hygiene and constant exposure to fermentable carbohydrates. Chronic malnutrition and illness also weakened immune defense, making gum infections more severe. When dental pain became unbearable, medieval treatment options were limited. Herbal remedies such as clove-like spices, where available, mint, or vinegar rinses may have provided temporary relief by numbing the area or reducing odor and discomfort. Warm compresses could reduce pain. However, once a deep infection formed, such as a dental abscess, pain would persist and swelling could increase. Extraction was the most direct solution. This was usually performed by barber surgeons, who handled many practical procedures. The goal was not elegance. The goal was removal. Without anesthesia, extraction depended on speed and force. Tools varied, including early forceps-like instruments. A patient might be restrained or supported physically while the tooth was pulled. From a scientific viewpoint, extraction sometimes helped because it removed the infected focus. If the tooth was the main source of bacterial growth, removal could allow the area to drain and reduce pressure. But the procedure also carried major risks. The tools were not sterile. Infection could worsen. Bleeding could be significant. And in some cases, the extraction could fracture the jaw or cause further tissue damage. Another risk was that medieval people often delayed treatment until the infection was severe. By the time extraction occurred, bacteria may already have spread beyond the tooth root. In modern medicine, this would require antibiotics and surgical drainage. In medieval conditions, the immune system alone had to fight the infection. Many patients survived. Many did not. Dental pain also had economic effects. A worker with severe tooth infection could not eat properly, sleep, or perform labor. Weakness increased, nutrition decreased further, and the cycle intensified. Dental disease reminds us that medieval medicine was constantly responding to problems created by daily life. Not every medical crisis was a plague outbreak. Many were personal, slow-building emergencies. Tooth infection is one of the clearest examples, a small internal wound, hidden in the mouth, capable of producing systemic failure. In medieval medical history, tooth extraction was not a crude spectacle. It was an attempt to remove infection when no better option existed. It reflects the harsh reality of pre-modern healthcare, painful procedures, limited tools, and survival depending on luck, strength, and speed. One of the most common medieval diagnostic methods was uroscopy, examining a patient's urine. Modern medicine uses urine testing with chemistry and microscopy, but medieval doctors relied on direct observation, color, clarity, sediment, and sometimes smell. This approach may seem primitive, yet it was an early attempt at systematic diagnosis using physical evidence rather than pure superstition. In medieval medical practice, a physician might hold a glass flask of urine up to sunlight and inspect it carefully. The glass container itself mattered. Transparent urine flasks allowed the doctor to observe differences in tone and texture. Certain colors were associated with different conditions. Dark or concentrated urine could indicate dehydration or fever. Pale urine could indicate high fluid intake or weakness. Cloudiness could suggest infection, though medieval doctors did not understand bacteria. Physicians also looked for sediment. If particles settled at the bottom of the flask, it might be interpreted as a sign of imbalance in humors or internal corruption. Medieval medical texts included charts that classified urine appearances into categories, connecting them to body states. This created a repeatable system. Two physicians could look at similar urine and reach similar conclusions within the same medical logic. Scientifically, uroscopy had limited accuracy, but it was not completely useless. Severe dehydration, liver issues, blood in urine, or advanced illness can change urine color visibly. Fever often produces darker urine due to fluid loss. Some infections can make urine cloudy. So while medieval doctors could not identify specific pathogens, they could detect that the body was under stress. The problem was interpretation. Medieval physicians linked urine to the four humors, believing the body's fluids reflected internal balance. They might prescribe bloodletting, diet changes, or purging based on urine appearance. In some cases, mild supportive advice might help. In other cases, wrong treatment could weaken the patient further. Another major limitation was that urine could mislead. Many different diseases produce similar urine changes. A fever from pneumonia and a fever from typhus may look the same in urine. Without additional tools, diagnosis remained uncertain. Some physicians over-relied on urine alone, which became a problem in medical culture. Even medieval critics complained about urine doctors who diagnosed without examining the patient. Despite these flaws, uroscopy represents an early medical mindset: analyze what the body produces, compare patterns, and build categories. In modern science, classification and pattern recognition are core skills. Medieval uroscopy was an early form of that approach, constrained by lack of technology. In a medieval world without laboratory medicine, uroscopy was one of the few methods that gave physicians a sense of control. It turned illness into something visible. And in the history of medicine, it shows that the medieval period was not completely blind. Doctors were observing real biological signals, even if they could not fully understand their causes. Medieval medicine faced a major barrier that modern viewers often underestimate: pain. Without modern anesthesia, many treatments were limited not only by medical knowledge, but by what a conscious human body could endure. Pain affected surgical decisions, patient cooperation, and survival outcomes. For minor pain, headache, mild fever discomfort, toothache, medieval people relied on herbal substances with calming effects. Certain plants contain compounds that reduce pain or induce sedation. Willow bark could reduce pain and fever due to salicylates. Some preparations used poppy-derived substances, which can contain opiate compounds. However, dosing was inconsistent and dangerous. Too little had no effect. Too much could depress breathing or cause poisoning. Alcohol was another widely used tool. Wine, ale, and stronger spirits in later periods could dull pain and anxiety. Alcohol does not eliminate pain, but it reduces awareness and fear. For procedures like tooth extraction, wound stitching, or abscess drainage, alcohol could be used to reduce panic and make the patient easier to manage. The medical effect was limited, but psychologically it mattered. Physical restraint was often necessary. If a patient moved suddenly during a procedure, the injury could worsen. Assistants or family members might hold the patient down. This was not cruelty in intention. It was risk control in a context where one wrong movement could mean a deeper cut or fatal bleeding. Some medieval texts mention sleeping potions or sedative mixtures. These could include strong herbs, but again, reliability was low. Many mixtures were more symbolic than pharmacologically effective. Still, the broader point is clear: medieval medicine did seek sedation, even if its methods were inconsistent. Pain control also affected how long a surgeon could operate. Many medieval surgical decisions prioritized speed. The faster the procedure, the lower the risk of shock and panic. Shock, in medical terms, is a state where the body cannot maintain stable circulation and oxygen delivery. Trauma, blood loss, and extreme pain can contribute to shock. In a medieval setting without fore fluids or monitoring, shock was often fatal. Because of these limits, medieval surgery focused on external interventions. Complex internal surgery was rarely attempted. Not because medieval people lacked courage, but because the biological risk was too high. This is a scientifically important point: the history of medicine is not only the history of knowledge. It is also the history of technology. Without safe anesthesia, even correct surgical ideas cannot be applied reliably. The body becomes the limiting factor. Medieval pain control, therefore, was real but weak. It relied on alcohol, basic herbal sedatives, and restraint. It was not enough to make surgery safe, but it made certain procedures possible. And it shows that medieval medicine was not indifferent to suffering. Practitioners were working against pain with the limited tools they had, while knowing that every cut could push the patient beyond endurance. Leech therapy was widely used in medieval and later pre-modern medicine as an alternative method of bloodletting. The logic behind it was the same as traditional bleeding. Removing blood was believed to correct imbalance in the body's humors and reduce inflammation or excess heat. However, leeches also produced effects that modern science can partially explain, which makes this practice more complex than pure superstition. Medicinal leeches attach to the skin and feed on blood. During feeding, leeches release biologically active substances in their saliva. Modern research identifies hirudin, a powerful anticoagulant, which prevents blood clotting. They also release compounds that can reduce local inflammation and improve blood flow. In modern medicine, leeches have been used in specific cases such as microsurgery and reconstructive procedures to relieve venous congestion, when blood cannot properly drain from tissue. This is a rare but real medical use. In medieval times, these mechanisms were not known. Leeches were used broadly, for headaches, fever, swelling, skin discoloration, and pain. Practitioners often applied them to areas near the affected body part, guided by humoral reasoning. For example, if someone had a swollen limb, leeches might be applied locally to draw out excess fluid and blood. Leech therapy could create short-term relief in some conditions because reducing blood volume locally can decrease pressure, and anticoagulant effects can improve blood circulation in congested tissue. But these benefits were highly limited compared to modern targeted use. In many cases, leech therapy did not address the real cause of illness. It could not kill bacteria, stop viral infections, or treat dehydration. The risks were significant. Excessive blood loss could weaken patients, especially those already malnourished or feverish. A weakened patient has reduced oxygen delivery and less ability to fight infection. Another risk was secondary infection. If leeches were reused or stored poorly, they could transmit bacteria. Modern medical leech use requires strict handling protocols. Medieval practice had none. Leeches also became an attractive treatment because they were cleaner and less visibly violent than cutting a vein. For some patients, the idea of a leech felt less terrifying than a blade. In a world where trust mattered, the method could appear gentler even if the outcome was still risky. Scientifically, leech therapy is an example of a traditional practice that contained a small portion of real physiological effect, but was applied without correct diagnosis or dosage control. It was not a cure for epidemics. It was not a reliable treatment for infection. Yet it represents the medieval effort to manipulate the body's circulation and reduce symptoms. In the broader story of medieval medicine, leeches highlight a recurring pattern, an internally logical treatment system combined with limited biological understanding. Some benefits were real but narrow. Most outcomes depended on the patient's underlying condition and the severity of disease. Cough and respiratory symptoms were extremely common in medieval life. The causes ranged from mild colds to severe infections such as pneumonia and tuberculosis. In addition, constant exposure to indoor smoke irritated airways and increased chronic coughing even in healthy individuals. Medieval people could not distinguish viral from bacterial causes, but they developed a large set of cough treatments designed to reduce discomfort and help the patient breathe and rest. One of the most common approaches was syrup and soothing mixtures. Honey was frequently used because it coats the throat and reduces irritation. Modern medicine confirms that honey can reduce cough frequency in certain cases, especially in mild respiratory infections, though it is not a cure for serious disease. Herbal ingredients like thyme, mint, and rosemary were added for smell, warmth, and symptom relief. Warm liquids mattered because they supported hydration and reduced throat dryness. Another common method was steam and inhalation. A patient might breathe warm steam from boiled water infused with herbs. From a modern perspective, steam can loosen mucus and relieve nasal congestion temporarily. It also increases comfort and reduces dryness, which can help the patient rest. However, steam does not eliminate infection. In severe disease, symptom relief may not prevent deterioration. Smoke exposure created a paradox. Smoke caused respiratory irritation, yet many medieval treatments involved burning herbs or resins to clean the air. This was connected to the miasma concept, the belief that bad air caused illness. Burning herbs created strong smells that felt protective, and some plant smoke has mild antimicrobial effects in the air. But the more important effect was behavioral. People opened windows, avoided crowded rooms, and tried to change air circulation. That could reduce transmission of airborne pathogens even if the reasoning was wrong. Medieval cough treatments also included dietary changes. Physicians often recommended light foods, warm broths, and avoiding heavy meals. This advice aligns with supportive care principles. When the body is fighting infection, digestion is harder, and dehydration risk increases. Warm broth provides both calories and fluid. Yet medieval respiratory disease remained lethal. Tuberculosis and pneumonia could progress beyond symptom control. In those cases, cough syrups and steam could reduce suffering but not stop lung damage. Many patients would become weaker over time, develop fever, and eventually experience respiratory failure. Scientifically, medieval cough treatments are important because they show early symptom-targeted care. The goal was not to kill invisible pathogens. The goal was to support the body while the illness ran its course. That approach remains relevant today in mild illness management, although modern medicine can also attack the cause with antibiotics or antivirals when appropriate. The medieval world fought cough with what it had: honey, herbs, warmth, steam, and rest. Some of these helped. Many did not. But cough care highlights an important historical fact: not all medieval medicine was harmful. Some practices were low risk and genuinely improved patient comfort, which can matter in survival. One of the most influential medieval explanations for disease was the miasma theory, the belief that illness was caused by corrupted air, especially foul-smelling air rising from rotting waste, stagnant water, or decaying bodies. Modern science shows that many infectious diseases are caused by bacteria, viruses, and parasites, not by smell itself. However, the medieval focus on air was not entirely disconnected from reality, because smell often indicated unsanitary environments where pathogens and vectors were present. In medieval cities, bad odors came from real sources: open sewage, waste piles, animal manure, and polluted waterways. These conditions were directly linked to disease risk, particularly for waterborne and parasite-driven infections. So while the miasma explanation was incorrect at the microbial level, it pushed people to associate filth with illness, which is an important public health insight. The miasma theory shaped behavior. People carried aromatic herbs, flowers, or strong-smelling substances to protect themselves. They burned herbs and resins inside homes. They attempted to purify the air using smoke. On a biological level, these actions did not stop plague bacteria or typhus. But they sometimes led to improved ventilation. Opening windows and reducing indoor crowding could reduce the spread of respiratory infections. Moving away from filthy areas could also lower exposure to parasites and contaminated materials. During epidemics, miasma theory encouraged separation. If bad air came from sick people or certain districts, citizens avoided those spaces. This avoidance could reduce contact rates and transmission. In other words, the medieval logic produced some behavior that aligns with modern epidemic control: reduce exposure, reduce crowd density, and isolate danger zones. Miasma theory also influenced sanitation reforms in some cities. Over time, certain towns created rules about waste removal, street cleaning, and slaughterhouse location. These reforms were not always effective, and enforcement was inconsistent. But they show that medieval society did not ignore public health. It responded using the best causal model available. The danger of miasma theory was misdirection. It could cause people to focus on smell rather than true routes of transmission. For example, Plague was strongly associated with bad air, while the real transmission involved fleas and rodents, with possible respiratory spread in pneumonic plague. Burning incense did not stop fleas. Carrying flowers did not change rat populations. If people relied on smell-based protection alone, they remained vulnerable. Scientifically, miasma theory represents a key stage in medical history, a wrong explanation that still produced some correct interventions. It connected environment to health. It encouraged cleaner spaces. It promoted ventilation. These are real components of disease prevention, even though the biological mechanism was misunderstood. In the medieval context, people were trying to control invisible threats using visible signals, especially smell. They were wrong about microbes, but they were right about one broad truth: a dirty, crowded environment increases disease. And that principle remains scientifically valid. Quarantine was one of the earliest public health strategies that actually reduced epidemic spread, even before people understood bacteria. The idea was simple: limit contact between potentially infected individuals and healthy populations. In medieval Europe, quarantine became more organized during repeated plague outbreaks, especially in port cities that depended on trade and travel. From a scientific perspective, quarantine works by reducing the transmission rate of infectious disease. If fewer people come into contact with infected carriers, fewer new infections occur. This is true whether the disease spreads through respiratory droplets, contaminated materials, parasites, or close physical contact. Medieval people did not know Yersinia pestis or its transmission pathways, but they observed that movement and contact mattered. Ports were a critical danger zone. Ships brought cargo, people, and potentially disease. If plague or fever was reported in another region, a city could decide to hold ships outside the harbor or restrict entry. One of the most famous historical patterns is the use of a set waiting period before allowing entry. These waiting rules were not perfect and varied by city and time, but the underlying logic was clear: if disease appears within a certain time window, the travelers are risky. Quarantine was not only about ships. Cities used gates, guards, and checkpoints to control movement. People with visible signs of illness could be denied entry. Houses could be isolated. Some communities restricted markets or gatherings. These measures could reduce spread but also caused economic disruption and social tension. Merchants resisted restrictions. Families feared being trapped inside. And enforcement was uneven. The limitation of medieval quarantine was diagnostic uncertainty. Many infected people are contagious before obvious symptoms appear. Others may show mild symptoms and still spread disease. Medieval systems relied heavily on visible sickness, rumors, and fear-based decision-making. Still, even imperfect quarantine can reduce disease spread if it lowers contact rates across the population. Another limitation was that quarantine could not fully address the main plague vector, fleas and rats. If goods carried fleas, restricting sick humans alone was insufficient. However, quarantine still mattered because plague outbreaks often involved multiple transmission routes, including close contact and possibly respiratory spread in pneumonic cases. Reducing movement reduced overall risk. Quarantine shows a major turning point in medical history. It represents a shift from individual treatment to population-level prevention. Medieval doctors could not cure plague, but cities could attempt to slow it. This is the beginning of public health thinking, using rules, separation, and controlled movement to protect communities. Scientifically, quarantine is one of the clearest examples of a pre-modern intervention that aligns with modern epidemic control principles. It did not require germ theory to function. It required observation, organization, and collective action. And despite its harshness, quarantine saved lives by breaking chains of transmission. The plague doctor has become the most famous image of medieval disease, but the historical reality is more specific and more complex than popular myths suggest. The iconic beak mask is strongly associated with plague medicine, yet the fully developed, plague doctor costume, became more formalized in later plague periods rather than the earliest medieval outbreaks. Still, plague doctors as a role, medical workers dealing with epidemic disease, did exist in various forms. Their job was not heroic in the modern sense. Their primary function was practical: examine the sick, record deaths, recommend measures, and sometimes enforce isolation rules. In many towns, plague doctors were hired by city authorities because ordinary physicians fled outbreaks to avoid infection. A plague doctor could be young, less experienced, or financially desperate, accepting high risk for pay. The famous mask design reflected miasma theory. Doctors believed bad air caused disease, so they tried to protect themselves from foul smells. The beak could be filled with aromatic herbs, spices, or vinegar-soaked materials. From a modern scientific viewpoint, this offered limited protection. It might slightly reduce inhalation of droplets or improve psychological comfort, but it did not reliably block flea transmission or bacterial infection. Plague doctors also carried tools. Some used canes to keep distance or lift clothing without direct touch. They wore long coats, gloves, and hats to cover skin. This mattered because it created a crude physical barrier. While not sterile, it reduced direct contact with bodily fluids and contaminated surfaces. In that sense, plague doctors represent an early attempt at protective equipment. However, their medical treatments were often ineffective. They might recommend bloodletting, purging, herbal mixtures, or burning aromatics. Some advised isolation, diet restrictions, and cleanliness, which could be more useful. But a consistent cure did not exist. The plague doctor's impact was limited by three major scientific problems. First, they lacked effective therapy against bacterial infection. Second, they could not reliably identify contagious cases early enough. Third, they operated in an environment where the real drivers, rats, fleas, crowding, and poor sanitation, continued to exist. So why do plague doctors matter historically? Because they represent organized epidemic response. A city recognized that plague required specialized attention. Doctors became part of a system, reporting, advising, and managing crisis. Even when treatments failed, the role itself shaped public health structure. In summary, plague doctors were not medieval superheroes with a magic mask. They were medical workers operating under flawed theories and extreme conditions. Their clothing reflected the best protective logic available at the time. Their tools reflected the need for distance. Their presence reflected the early institutionalization of epidemic management. During major epidemics, burial became a public health emergency. When death rates rose rapidly, medieval communities struggled to manage bodies safely and respectfully. Modern science shows that the main plague transmission pathway was often flea-related, and bodies themselves were not necessarily the primary source of airborne infection in most cases. However, corpses were still part of a dangerous environment because they attracted pests, contaminated spaces, and forced close contact between workers and infected households. The true problem was scale. In severe outbreaks, deaths happened faster than burial systems could respond. Churches and cemeteries became overcrowded. Graveyards reached capacity. Labor collapsed as workers became sick or fled. This led to mass burial practices, large pits, quick burials, and minimal ceremony. From a scientific view, the greatest risk factors involved exposure and crowd behavior. When burial teams entered infected houses, they came into contact with contaminated clothing, bedding, fleas, and potentially respiratory droplets. The movement of bodies through streets also increased contact between households. Large gatherings around funerals could raise transmission, especially if disease spread through close proximity. Medieval people understood that death brought danger, even without microbes. Many feared being near the dead. Others feared social breakdown if burial stopped. Cities sometimes created rules to reduce risk, limiting funeral gatherings, speeding burial, assigning designated collectors, and removing bodies at night. These actions reduced contact rates and helped maintain control. Another factor was psychological. When a city saw carts carrying bodies, panic increased. Panic caused flight. Flight carried disease to new regions. This is historically important. Epidemics spread not only through biology, but through human reaction. Movement, collapse of order, and displacement became multipliers. Burial practices also affected sanitation. If bodies were left in homes too long, indoor conditions worsened. In summer outbreaks, decomposition accelerated and attracted insects. In winter, cold slowed decay but did not stop disease spread within crowded homes. Either way, the goal became rapid removal. From a modern epidemic viewpoint, burial management is part of crisis control. It reduces exposure, prevents gatherings, and stabilizes public behavior. Medieval cities did not have modern protective equipment, but they created functional responses under pressure, dedicated burial crews, quick disposal, and restrictions on social contact. This scene is important because it explains how outbreaks felt on the ground. Epidemics were not only medical events. They were logistical disasters. The moment burial systems collapsed, the city's ability to function collapsed too. So burial during plague was not just about grief. It was about infrastructure. It was about controlling movement, contact, and panic. And it was one of the clearest points where medieval society was forced to make harsh decisions to survive. To understand why plague spread so efficiently, we have to describe the transmission chain scientifically. Modern research shows that the bacterium Yersinia pestis is strongly associated with flea vectors. Fleas feed on infected animals, often rodents, and can transmit the bacterium when they bite new hosts. This mechanism explains why plague outbreaks were deeply linked to urban storage systems, grain supply, and the presence of rats. In medieval towns, grain was stored in bulk. Markets, warehouses, and household storerooms attracted rodents. Rats thrived where food was concentrated and waste was present. Once rats became infected, flea populations feeding on them could also become infected. When infected rats died, fleas sought new hosts. Humans became the next available source of blood meals. This shift from rodent to human hosts is a core biological pathway that helps explain explosive outbreaks. The flea mechanism involves bacterial survival in the flea's digestive system. In certain flea species, the bacteria can multiply and block the flea's gut, causing it to bite repeatedly and regurgitate infected material into the bite wound. This increases transmission. Medieval people could not observe this microscopic process. What they observed was pattern. Disease was worse in crowded districts, around markets, and in times of disrupted sanitation. However, plague transmission was not only flea-based. In pneumonic plague, infection spreads through respiratory droplets from coughing. This form is rarer but extremely dangerous because it can spread directly from person to person without rodents. That means a plague outbreak could have multiple modes of transmission operating at once, flea-driven cases in general population and respiratory-driven clusters in close contact settings. This scientific complexity is important. It explains why medieval control measures were inconsistent. Isolation might reduce respiratory spread, but not flea exposure. Burning herbs might reduce smell but not rats. Closing city gates might slow movement, but infected fleas could already exist inside. True control required reducing vectors and contact, something medieval cities could not fully accomplish. Environmental conditions also mattered. Flea populations rise with certain temperature and humidity conditions. Housing with straw bedding, wool clothing, and dense human living arrangements supports parasites. Even if plague started as a rodent flea problem, it could become a household problem when fleas entered beds, clothing, and shared rooms. The modern conclusion is straightforward: plague was an ecological disease. It involved bacteria, fleas, rodents, and human society. The medieval city provided the perfect ecosystem for this system to function. When trade expanded and cities grew larger, the network of disease expanded too. Understanding this transmission chain is not about blaming medieval hygiene. It is about recognizing that plague was supported by infrastructure and biology working together. Without pest control, without safe storage, and without modern medical intervention, medieval communities were facing a highly efficient biological system, one designed to spread rapidly through exactly the environment they lived in. Medieval people lacked germ theory, but they still attempted disinfection. Their goal was usually expressed as purifying the environment, removing corruption, and fighting bad air. Many methods were ineffective against major epidemics, yet some practices had partial real-world benefits, especially when they reduced contamination and contact. One of the most common substances used was vinegar. Vinegar is acidic, and mild acids can inhibit bacterial growth on surfaces. Medieval caregivers used vinegar to clean rooms, wipe furniture, and sometimes wash hands or cloth. This did not sterilize tools in a modern sense, but it could reduce microbial load and odor. Vinegar was also used in aromatic mixtures, combined with herbs to create strong-smelling, protective liquids. Another practice was washing and laundering. Clean cloth reduces parasite density and removes contaminated fluids. In an outbreak, laundering bedding and clothing could reduce lice and fleas if heat was involved. The problem was feasibility. Boiling water required fuel and time. In winter, drying cloth was difficult. Many households did not have the resources to wash everything frequently. Boiling was one of the most scientifically effective accidental practices. Heat kills many pathogens. Boiled water is safer than raw water, and boiled broths reduce exposure to waterborne disease. Again, medieval people often boiled liquids for cooking rather than safety, but it still reduced infection risk. Warm food and drink also supported hydration and energy, improving survival. Smoke and burning herbs were widely used. From a modern viewpoint, smoke does not cure infection. However, burning certain plants can reduce insects in enclosed spaces, and strong smoke can drive pests away temporarily. More importantly, these rituals encouraged ventilation. Opening windows and changing air flow can reduce exposure to respiratory droplets and lower indoor crowd density. Cities sometimes attempted public cleaning. Streets were cleared, waste removed, and foul-smelling areas addressed. These actions were inconsistent, but they reflect an early awareness that environment affects health. During plague years, some cities organized sanitation rules and restricted certain activities like waste dumping or animal slaughter in crowded districts. The scientific lesson is that disinfection has levels. Medieval practices could sometimes reduce risk slightly, especially when they involved cleaning, boiling, and limiting contaminated materials. But they could not reliably stop a fast-moving epidemic driven by fleas, rodents, and respiratory spread. Still, these attempts matter historically. They show that medieval society was not passive. People tried to control risk using the tools they had. Some methods were symbolic. Some were practical. And a few, like boiling water, washing linens, and reducing crowding, were closer to modern prevention than medieval people realized. In many epidemics, the difference between survival and death was not the best medicine. It was the least exposure. Disinfection attempts were part of that struggle, even if the science behind them was incomplete. Epidemics create fear, and fear creates a market. During major medieval outbreaks, especially plague years, many people searched for quick solutions. This opened the door to medical fraud, miracle cures, and sellers who exploited panic. These practices were not unique to the Middle Ages. They reflect a universal human pattern: when science cannot provide certainty, misinformation spreads rapidly. In medieval towns, markets became places where medicine and commerce overlapped. Apothecaries sold real herbs, but traveling sellers also offered secret mixtures, charms, and protective objects. Some claimed they had rare ingredients from distant lands. Others sold powders promising immunity. In reality, most of these products had no effect against deadly infectious disease. Many cures were based on the miasma concept. People believed disease entered through bad air, so products focused on smell, aromatic pouches, perfumes, vinegar sponges, or burning resins. These could make people feel protected and might even reduce anxiety, but they did not eliminate the bacteria or vectors driving plague spread. Religious items were also sold, blessed objects, written prayers, protective amulets. These were spiritually meaningful to many people, but medically they could not stop bacterial infection. Some sellers mixed religion with commerce, claiming divine protection in exchange for money. This intensified social tension and mistrust. Another form of fraud involved exaggerating ordinary remedies. Herbal teas that reduced cough or nausea were presented as plague cures. Some sellers might unintentionally believe in their product. Others knowingly lied. Without standardized medicine, no one could easily prove or disprove claims. Survival outcomes were random enough that sellers could point to success stories and ignore failures. From a scientific perspective, medical fraud becomes stronger when three conditions exist: lack of effective treatment, high fear, and low regulation. Medieval epidemics met all three. Doctors could not cure plague. Citizens were desperate. And public authorities struggled to control information in trade. This scene matters because it shows the social side of medieval disease. Outbreaks were not only biological. They created economic opportunism, misinformation, and panic behavior. People spent money on useless protection instead of improving practical survival factors like isolation, hydration, and cleanliness. That misallocation of effort could indirectly increase mortality. Yet medieval communities were not completely helpless. Some towns regulated apothecary practices and punished fraudulent sellers. In some cases, authorities attempted to control plague medicine markets. Enforcement was difficult, but it existed. The scientific lesson remains relevant: in any epidemic, information becomes as important as medicine. When false cures spread, they distort behavior. Medieval society experienced this problem intensely, and the results were predictable: fear-driven decisions, wasted resources, and continued transmission. Bloodletting remained one of the most common medieval medical interventions, but from a modern clinical perspective, it was often harmful, especially during infections. The core problem is simple: most lethal medieval diseases were caused by pathogens, and bloodletting does not remove bacteria or viruses from the body in a controlled, therapeutic way. When a person has an infection, the immune system needs oxygen, energy, and stable circulation to function. Blood carries oxygen through red blood cells and maintains blood pressure. Removing blood reduces circulating volume and can weaken oxygen delivery. In an already malnourished medieval patient, this could accelerate collapse. Fever increases metabolic demand, the heart works harder, dehydration is common. Blood loss during this state raises the risk of shock and organ failure. Medieval physicians used bloodletting because it fit humoral logic. Fever was interpreted as excess heat or excess blood. Swelling was seen as overflow. Headache was seen as pressure. These symptoms were real, but their cause was misinterpreted. The treatment targeted the theory, not the disease mechanism. Another factor was timing. Many patients were bled repeatedly. Repeated bleeding can cause anemia, weakness, and poor wound healing. That means even if the original illness was survivable, the patient became less able to recover. In some cases, bloodletting might have created a temporary feeling of relief due to decreased pressure or placebo effect, but it did not improve survival in serious infections. The scientific comparison is clear: modern medicine sometimes removes blood only in specific conditions, such as polycythemia vera or hemochromatosis, where excess blood cells or iron are the problem. Those are rare and defined. Medieval bloodletting was generalized and applied to many unrelated illnesses. Bloodletting was also a risk pathway for infection. Blades were not sterile. Hands were not disinfected. Bandages could spread contamination. A small cut could become a new entry point for bacteria, leading to local infection and systemic spread. This is one reason medieval procedures sometimes turned one illness into multiple problems. So why did the practice survive for centuries? Because medicine needs a visible action. A patient wanted proof that something was being done. Bloodletting was measurable, dramatic, and repeatable. In a world without antibiotics, many treatments had uncertain outcomes. Bloodletting offered a sense of control, even if it was biologically misguided. Scientifically, this scene teaches a critical lesson: a treatment can be logical inside a belief system and still be wrong in reality. Medieval bloodletting was not stupidity, it was a consistent response to an incorrect model. But when infection was the true enemy, losing blood often meant losing the fight. Among medieval treatments, abscess drainage was one of the few interventions that could genuinely improve a patient's outcome. An abscess is a localized pocket of infection, usually filled with pus. In modern clinical terms, pus contains immune cells, dead tissue, bacteria, and inflammatory debris. When pus is trapped in a closed cavity, pressure rises, pain increases, and blood circulation around the infected area decreases. That reduced circulation makes it harder for the immune system to reach the infection effectively. Even today, abscess management often requires drainage. Antibiotics alone may not fully resolve a collection of pus, because drugs struggle to penetrate the thick material and the sealed cavity. Medieval surgeons did not know bacteria, but they did understand the visible progression: a swollen painful lump could become larger, hotter, and more dangerous over time. They also observed that releasing the trapped fluid often reduced pain and sometimes prevented the spread of illness. The procedure was straightforward but high risk. A barber surgeon or healer would examine the swelling and decide when to open it. Many believed that ripening the abscess mattered, meaning the swelling needed to soften before cutting. In practice, warm compresses could help bring an abscess closer to the surface and encourage drainage. Heat increases blood flow, which can support local immune response. When the abscess was opened, pus could drain out, reducing internal pressure. This is the core scientific benefit: decreased bacterial load and improved circulation in the area. However, medieval drainage was performed without sterile technique. Tools were reused. Hands were not disinfected. Bandages might already be contaminated. Therefore, drainage could also introduce new bacteria or spread infection further if done carelessly. After drainage, medieval caregivers often cleaned wounds with wine or vinegar. These liquids contain compounds that can reduce bacterial growth, though they are far weaker than modern antiseptics. Honey-based dressings were also used historically in wound care, and modern research supports honey's antimicrobial activity in certain wound environments. These methods did not guarantee safety, but they could provide partial protection. The main danger was systemic infection. If bacteria entered the bloodstream, the patient could develop fever, confusion, weakness, and collapse, what modern medicine identifies as sepsis. Medieval practitioners lacked a concept of sepsis as a microbial syndrome, but they recognized the pattern: when fever rose after a wound problem, the situation became life-threatening. Abscess drainage represents an important point in medieval medical history. It shows that some medieval interventions were not based purely on symbolism. They were based on practical observation of cause and effect. Releasing infected fluid often helped. It did not cure plague or tuberculosis, but in localized soft tissue infection, it could genuinely prevent a worse outcome. This is why medieval surgeons were essential in daily life. Their success depended on experience, speed, and luck. But in the case of abscess drainage, their actions sometimes aligned with modern medical logic, removing infection pressure and allowing healing to begin. Broken bones were common in medieval society because daily life involved constant physical risk. Farming, construction, animal handling, transport work, and warfare all increased the chance of falls, crush injuries, and blunt trauma. In medical terms, fractures are dangerous not only because of pain, but because they can cause internal bleeding, infection, and permanent disability. Medieval communities developed practical methods for fracture care. The basic principle, immobilization, does not require modern science to be discovered. If a broken limb moves, pain increases and healing fails. If it is stabilized, pain decreases and healing becomes possible. Medieval practitioners used wooden boards, bark strips, stiff cloth wraps, and tight bandaging to keep limbs from moving. These early splints were imperfect but could be effective for simple fractures. Setting the bone was a major challenge. If the bone fragments were misaligned, the limb could heal in a bent or shortened position. That created long-term disability. A medieval healer might attempt to pull and align a limb by hand, then bind it tightly. Without imaging and sterile environments, success depended heavily on experience. Another major risk was open fractures, where the skin was broken and the bone was exposed or near exposure. This created a direct route for bacteria to enter tissue. Modern medicine treats this as an emergency requiring cleaning, surgery, and antibiotics. Medieval medicine could not stop bone infection effectively. Once infection entered bone tissue, the result could be chronic infection, fever, sepsis, and death. Pain control was minimal. A patient with a fracture often endured intense pain during alignment and splinting. After stabilization, recovery required weeks to months. During this time, the patient needed food, warmth, and support. Survival was therefore partly medical and partly social. A strong family network increased survival chances. Isolation increased the risk of neglect and death. Medieval fracture care also illustrates a reality: medicine is not only about curing disease, it is also about preserving function. If a medieval worker lost the ability to walk or use an arm, economic survival became uncertain. This led to a cycle where injury created poverty, and poverty increased vulnerability to illness. From a scientific viewpoint, splinting and immobilization represent one of the more reliable medieval practices. It did not stop infection, but it helped basic healing. In many cases, medieval fracture care could successfully restore mobility, especially when wounds remained closed and the patient's nutrition was adequate. This scene matters because it proves medieval medicine was not entirely theoretical. It included practical biomechanics and physical care. Even without modern tools, medieval people understood that the body can repair itself, if it is supported, stabilized, and protected from further damage. Childbirth in medieval Europe was one of the most dangerous events in everyday life. Even when pregnancy was normal, delivery involved major physiological stress, blood loss, and vulnerability to infection. Modern obstetrics reduces these risks through sterile technique, antibiotics, blood transfusion, and surgical intervention. Medieval communities lacked all of these, which made childbirth mortality far higher than today. Midwives were the primary specialists in childbirth. They relied on practical experience rather than academic training. Their skills included managing positioning, assisting delivery, monitoring bleeding, and supporting the mother through prolonged labor. Many births were successful, and midwives could provide effective care in normal cases. But in complicated births, such as obstructed labor, heavy hemorrhage, retained placenta, or postpartum infection, options were extremely limited. Postpartum hemorrhage was a major threat. Excessive bleeding after delivery can cause shock. In modern medicine, this can be treated with medications, surgery, and transfusion. In medieval settings, the body had to compensate alone. If bleeding could not be controlled, death could occur quickly. Infection was another primary danger. After delivery, the uterus and birth canal are vulnerable to bacterial invasion. Without sterile conditions, bacteria could enter and multiply. This could lead to postpartum sepsis, high fever, weakness, confusion, and rapid decline. Medieval observers might describe this as a sudden deadly fever after childbirth. Once it began, there was no reliable treatment. Medieval care focused on warmth, rest, and nourishment. Broths and fluids were important because dehydration and weakness increased risk. Herbal preparations were used for pain and recovery, but they could not stop severe bacterial infection. Clean cloth and boiling water could reduce risk if applied, but resources were limited and knowledge was inconsistent. Childbirth risk also connects directly to medieval demographic reality. High maternal mortality affected family structure and child survival. If a mother died, newborn survival decreased sharply due to lack of feeding and care. This created cascading mortality within families. Scientifically, medieval childbirth illustrates a key lesson of medical history. The biggest survival improvements often came not from new theories, but from infection control. The introduction of sterile technique and antibiotics in later centuries dramatically reduced postpartum deaths. In medieval times, the absence of these tools made childbirth a high-risk medical crisis even in ordinary households. This scene is essential to any realistic medieval medical story. It shows that danger was not limited to epidemics. It existed inside the most common life event, bringing a child into the world, where medicine had little power and survival depended on physiology, experience, and chance. At the center of medieval medical failure was one dominant enemy: infection. Most deadly conditions were ultimately driven by microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, and parasites, yet medieval medicine lacked the tools to identify them, prevent them reliably, or treat them effectively once they spread. Without germ theory, doctors could not accurately link cause and effect. A fever might be interpreted as an excess of blood. A cough might be interpreted as excess phlegm. A wound infection might be interpreted as corrupted humors. These interpretations created treatments that targeted symptoms, not biological mechanisms. Modern medicine defeats infection through three key systems: sanitation and clean water, sterilization and hygiene in medical care, and antimicrobial therapy like antibiotics. Medieval society had only partial versions of the first two, and none of the third. This meant that even minor infections could become fatal. The consequences were predictable. Dehydration from diarrhea killed quickly. Pneumonia killed by preventing oxygen exchange. Tuberculosis killed slowly by chronic lung destruction. Wound infections killed through sepsis. Childbirth complications killed through bleeding and postpartum infection. These are not mysterious deaths. They are medically explainable outcomes of untreated infection and physiological stress. Medieval hospitals and caregivers provided supportive care, rest, warmth, food, nursing, and basic wound cleaning. Supportive care can save lives in mild disease. But it cannot stop a severe bacterial invasion. Once infection entered deep tissue or bloodstream, medieval medicine had little power to reverse it. This does not mean medieval practitioners were useless. Many were skilled observers. Many applied procedures that sometimes worked, like abscess drainage and splinting fractures. The limitation was technological, not moral. From a scientific viewpoint, medieval medicine represents a stage where observation existed but microbial causation was missing. It was a world where people tried to manage disease with incomplete information. And because infectious disease was the main killer, success remained inconsistent. This scene functions as the summary of the entire video. Medieval medicine repeatedly collided with infection, and infection usually won, not because medieval society did nothing, but because the tools that truly changed survival had not yet been developed. The medieval medical world is often remembered through extreme images: plague masks, bloodletting bowls, and crude surgery. But the real story is more scientific and more human. Most medieval death was not caused by mysterious curses. It was caused by infection, dehydration, respiratory failure, and untreated complications. Medieval people did not know germs, but they were not blind. They observed that disease spread through crowded streets. They noticed that some neighborhoods were hit harder than others. They saw that cleanliness sometimes helped. They developed quarantine rules. They created hospitals that provided shelter and food. They used herbs for symptom relief. Surgeons learned practical techniques to treat wounds, drain abscesses, and stabilize fractures. Midwives carried life-saving experience in childbirth. None of these were fantasy. They were real systems of care. The limitations were biological. Without antibiotics, a deep infection could not be reversed. Without sterile instruments, procedures created new risks. Without safe water systems, diarrheal disease kept returning. Without accurate diagnosis, fever remained a mystery with many causes. The medieval world was fighting a microscopic enemy it could not see. From a modern scientific viewpoint, the lesson is clear: effective medicine requires correct causation. It requires understanding transmission. It requires prevention systems that protect whole communities, not only individuals. Medieval society was beginning to learn these ideas through experience, but the final breakthroughs came later with laboratory science and microbial discovery. This is why medieval medicine is not a joke in medical history. It is the stage where humanity learned, through repeated failure and partial success, that disease was not random. It followed patterns. It had routes. It had causes, even if those causes were invisible at the time. So the conclusion of medieval disease and treatment is not a miracle cure. It is a record of survival under pressure, and a slow movement from tradition toward evidence. The Middle Ages did not solve infection, but they left behind the observations that made future solutions possible. In the end, medieval medicine shows a truth that remains valid today: in epidemics, prevention matters as much as treatment. Clean water matters. Isolation matters. Hygiene matters. And knowledge, real scientific knowledge, is the most powerful medical tool humans have ever developed.